We will now hear Brother Nathan Taylor on the theme, Grace to the Humble.
Thanks, Brother Timothy. And indeed, that sad announcement this morning reminds us of our great need, doesn't it? Our brother Michael now sleeps in the hope of the resurrection. And we also, over this week, has seen the anniversary of the death of our brother Gary too. And today we gather around another one to remember his death, don't we? But the one whose death we remember today is the one that provides strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow. Because the one whose death we remember today came out of that grave, didn't he? To lead all that follow him into life eternal. And we do indeed pray for strength and blessing to be upon all those that mourn. The letter of James was written to the brethren and sisters, the Jewish brethren and sisters who have been dispersed from Jerusalem. And it's a very warm letter. In fact, about 15 times James refers to them as brethren. He also refers to them as my brethren, and 3 times my beloved brethren. So there's a lot of warmth in this letter as James writes to his fellow members of the Jerusalem ecclesia that have been scattered. But in this epistle, James does not hold back from confronting them with some hard truths and some challenges. And in this epistle he speaks about the practical outworking of faith and also of knowledge. When reading James 3 and 4, I think there's a little bit of a section here that runs from James chapter 3 verse 13 where we read, "Who is a wise man and endued with knowledge among you? Let him show out of a good conversation, or good conduct, his works with meekness of wisdom." And then we come to 4 verse 17, "Therefore to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin." So it's like there's this section here where James is speaking about the need for knowledge and for that knowledge to guide us into right ways. I think otherwise when you come to verse 17 it sort of seems a little bit out of context, but that's how I read it anyway. From 3 verse 13 to 4 verse 17 we've got this section here where James is particularly speaking about the right sort of knowledge that we need and the practical outworking of that knowledge. But he speaks about 2 different kinds of knowledge here. In James chapter 3, verse 13, we've got this knowledge, who is endued with this knowledge. With knowledge among you, let him show out of a good conversation his works with meekness of wisdom. So there's a wise man with a knowledge that leads him to good conduct. But then we read about a different sort of wisdom in verse 15. Wisdom that descendeth not from above. Wisdom that is earthly, sensual and devilish. The word used for wisdom here is the Greek word sophia, and it can relate to either a higher or a lower form of wisdom. And this is what we've got presented here, isn't it? We've got 2 forms of wisdom. So the second, that which is earthly, sensual and devilish, maybe we might not always understand that in the traditional sense of wisdom. In fact, it's foolishness, isn't it? But it's a knowledge, it's an apprehension of something, whether at a higher level or at the very base level here. So 2 different ways of thinking. Now in the James chapter 2, James has presented, hasn't he? He said that we have to have faith and our faith has to have an outworking. But you either have faith or you don't have faith. In chapter 3 and 4, he presents to us, he says, you've got to have knowledge and that's got to have its right outworking. But he says, just be careful because there are in fact 2 forms of knowledge, 2 sorts of wisdom. And he's going to contrast these 2. And he's going to ask his brethren, and he's going to ask us here today, is our knowledge the right sort of knowledge? Do we have that in its purity? And he goes on to say, well, we're going to demonstrate the sort of wisdom that we have, the sort of wisdom that we have obtained by its manifestation in our lives. Verse 13, who is a wise man endued with knowledge among you? Let him show out of a good conduct his works with the meekness of wisdom. And he goes on and then he says, but if ye have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, glory not and lie not against the truth. This wisdom descendeth not from above, but is earthly, sensual, and devilish. So, verse 13, we've got a form of wisdom that will cause a person to have good conduct in their life. They demonstrate that they have been imbued with this wisdom which is from above. But he says, on the other hand, if you find that you have bitter jealousy and selfishness, as it is in the NET version, if you have bitter jealousy and selfishness in your hearts, do not boast and tell lies against the truth. So he says there's a test, isn't there? Good works, or is there bitter jealousy and selfishness? Is there a perception that you are more worthy, more deserving than others? Is that how you live your life? Because that shows that you've got the wrong sort of wisdom. You're led by wrong sort of thinking. This is putting self first, isn't it? This has been driven by the pride of life. There's a pride here, isn't there? A pride of life that wants us, me, to have better than everyone else. I am more deserving and I should have everything that everyone else has got and more. And he says of that sort of attitude, he says, do not boast. Don't boast about that. That should be a source of shame, not of glory. And to claim to hold the truth and allow such an attitude would be to lie against the truth or to be false to the truth, as it is in the ESV. So if we are brethren of Christ, if we claim to be brethren of Christ, but we manifest by our attitude, by our selfishness, by our jealousy and putting self first, by the pride of life, if that's what comes out in our life, well then we're being false to the truth, aren't we? We're being false to our calling, being false to the gospel. Because that wisdom, we read in verse 15, the wisdom that leads to this bitter envying and strife, that descendeth not from above. It's earthly, sensual, devilish. For where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. So here, quite clearly, this is the lower wisdom, isn't it? This is the worldly wisdom, earthly, sensual, devilish. It doesn't come from above. It's not higher. It's base. And so here we're being told, aren't we, that this jealousy and selfishness demonstrates that we lack godly wisdom and we're just following natural thinking, the thinking that we were born with, the thinking that we inherited. And the practical outworking of that earthly, sensual and devilish thinking is jealousy and selfishness, which will result in verse 16, confusion and every evil work. Word confusion there translated disorder by the NET, and as Sam read for us from the ESV. It results in confusion and every evil work. And if we look around the world today, we can see how true that is, can't we? A world that rejects any wisdom from above, that works on those that base thinking of man, where has that got the world to? Instability, disorder, and every evil work is there because men have not taken the wisdom which is from above. They've got the wisdom that they've inherited from their parents, that which is driven by the lust of the flesh, and they've put that into action, and they haven't changed their thinking, and therefore we see outside, don't we, the results of that. But he goes on in verse 17, he says, but the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, and easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. So here it speaks of the purity of this wisdom. It means it's clean. That's the literal sense of the word. But here we've got a wisdom that is from above. The wisdom that is to be in our hearts is, first of all, we've got to make sure that it's pure. That the wisdom, the thinking that we have in our hearts, in our minds, the thinking that leads and guides us, is not contaminated by that which is earthly, sensual and devilish. That we take the wisdom from above in its purity, and we allow that to obliterate any other thinking that's in our minds and our hearts. That's a great challenge, isn't it? We've got to have that wisdom which God gives us in purity. That is what we are called upon to strive for. And this true wisdom, it's not what we're born with, is it? It comes to us from above. And we must allow this wisdom to enter into us. That's what it means, doesn't it? So in verse 13 it says, with meekness of wisdom. Weymouth translate that, the end of verse 13, as being by a wisely teachable spirit. Like the little children that Christ spoke about. Ready to receive something else, saying, I don't know everything. I don't know. I need to be taught, I need to be educated, and opening our hearts and our minds up to a new way of thinking and to receiving that wisdom which comes from above and to taking that into our lives. To humbly accept that we need to be taught the correct way of thinking. And thereby we are willing to receive the instruction in God's ways. And this is one of the good and perfect gifts that God gives, doesn't he? James 1 verse 17 says, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. Everything that's good and everything that's perfect, it comes from above. And so it is with wisdom. That wisdom which comes from above is a good gift and it's perfect, isn't it? And we've got to open up our hearts. That we've got to, first of all, empty ourselves of ourselves, don't we? With meekness to accept that teaching from God, to know that we need to be taught. And to be willing to push aside all of those the natural way of thinking that we inherently have, and to replace that with the thinking which comes from above. And so this is an admission, isn't it, that my thinking needs to be changed. I need something done because I don't think right. I need to change the way I think. I'm not wise in the things of God. I must be taught. And I must be open to be being taught. And the traits that come from that wisdom that are described in verse 17 are probably not the sort of traits you would normally ascribe to wisdom, are they? Speaks there about peaceableness, gentleness, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, without hypocrisy. I guess if you sort of thought of wisdom in worldly terms, you would think of success and achievement, of rising above, being noted for your brilliant intelligence, making a mark in this world. But that's not what's being described here, is it? It says the wisdom that comes from above, that enters into our hearts, God gives us that wisdom so that it will change our way of thinking, our way of acting. Not so much that we can become cleverer than everyone else or more successful than everyone else, just so that we can become nicer. That's the object of God giving us his wisdom, isn't it? Not to achieve great things in this world, apart from to be nice people. Manifestations of the glory of God. We can glory in that, can't we? That the previous verses says, you don't boast in the things that come from the flesh, but our glory should be that we bear the image of God, don't we? That we manifest his character, peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, without hypocrisy, taking on a different way of life. And this is about following the royal law, isn't it, that James speaks of? To love your neighbour as yourself, to put others first, to submit self to the needs of others. It's a change of character, isn't it? For the purpose that God might be glorified. Not that the flesh will be exalted, but that God himself will be glorified. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. So those who make peace, those who live in that way that is peaceable and gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, without hypocrisy, being such nice people. These people are the people that make peace, don't they? They have good relationships. And it says of those people, the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace for those people. And when you put those words together, at least for me, when you put righteousness and peace together, where does your mind go? Well, mine went to Psalm 72. Righteousness and peace. The mountains shall bring peace to the people, and little hills by righteousness. In his days shall the righteous flourish, and abundance of peace, so long as the moon endureth. So I think what James is alluding to here, he is saying the people that are peacemakers, the people that take on the wisdom of God and show that by a lovely character displayed in their life, they are people destined for the kingdom. Because they already portray the hallmarks of the kingdom in righteousness and peace. And such will be their reward. When we come to James chapter 4, though, we've got a great contrast, haven't we? To those that are peaceable and gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, without hypocrisy, people that make for peace. James chapter 4, verse 1. From whence come wars and fighting among you? Come they not hence even of your lust that war in your members? You lust and have not, you kill, you desire to have, you cannot obtain, you fight, you war, yet you have not because you ask not. Such a complete contrast, isn't it, to the end of chapter 3. And here James is portraying, isn't he, the contrast between those two different forms of wisdom. Wisdom that is from above, or wisdom that is earthly and sensual and devilish. And what's the outcome of them? Completely different, aren't they? They're poles apart. No wonder he speaks about the need to maintain the wisdom of God in purity, because it is just so different. It is so opposed to the thinking of the flesh, isn't it? And the outworking of those two ways of thinking are in complete contrast. There's no way that the two can be joined together, is there? And here he describes extreme behaviour, doesn't he? To satisfy the lust of the flesh. To kill, to fight, to war. Well, surely this was only figurative language of what was happening in the house of God. We would hope so, wouldn't we? But he goes on, he speaks there, doesn't he, of the origin of the disputes is lusts within individuals. Your flesh, your lusts that war in your members. You are the problem, he says. You who have not dispelled the thinking of the flesh, You who have not opened your hearts humbly to receive the wisdom of God, that's where the problem comes from. Your lust that war in your members. James 1:14, he's reminded us, hasn't he, that every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust. That's the problem. It's in us. It's ours. It's ours, and that is what needs to be removed, driven out by the thinking that we are going to take in the Word of God and dispel that other thinking outside of us, to take that away. Because let that remain. Let that thinking that we are naturally born with, the thinking that we are important and we have to look after ourselves and we're more deserving than others, it naturally comes with that pride of life. It's going to lead to such heartache and trouble, isn't it? And we note that such lusts are never satisfied. It speaks about them having not. They cannot obtain. There's the lust of the flesh rising up, taking extreme measures to satisfy it. But whatever you do, you're never going to fulfill those lusts. You're never going to be satisfied in life. If you're driven by that natural thinking, and it's just going to lead to disorder and to every evil work, dissatisfaction, discontentment, resentment. All those evil thinking is going to come from within, isn't it? Whereas if men in humility ask for wisdom from above, a change of that thinking, and thereby a change of attitude, then you could get satisfaction. James chapter 1 verse 5 says, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given him." So rather than seeking to satisfy the lust of the flesh, if we seek to God to attain his wisdom, then that will get rid of all that strife and contention, all that dissatisfaction in our life, won't it? It'll drive that out. If we ask for wisdom from God, he will give us that wisdom, and that will solve the problem within and outside of us. It will give us satisfaction in life. It'll make us nicer people and give us better relationships. That is what they should have been doing. We can't expect God, though, who stands opposed to all that our lusts bring about, we can't expect God to satisfy those lusts, can we? So he says in verse 3, "You ask and you receive not because you ask amiss, that you may consume it upon your lusts." So I think he says you don't ask in verse 2, and then he says you ask and don't receive in verse 3. I think it's talking about two different things, isn't it? They don't ask for what's right. They don't ask for the wisdom from God, from James chapter 1 verse 5. But they do ask for all the things that they think are going to satisfy their needs, or that we think are going to satisfy our needs, because we're driven by the same natural instincts, aren't we, unless we curb and control them. You ask and receive not because you ask amiss, that you may consume it on your lusts. So who's number one here? It's all about me, isn't it? That I want to expend all of that goodness that God is going to give me just to satisfy my lust, my desire. The word lust there is the Greek word hedone, and I guess we know what words are derived from that. Hedonism, hedonistic, isn't it? To take desire to satisfy oneself. Consume it upon your hedonistic lifestyle. Or New King James, you may spend it on your pleasures. So here it is, there's this way of thinking that just wants to satisfy the selfish lusts. And we think, don't we, of the example that Solomon provided. When God said, "What do you want, Solomon?" What did he say? "I want wisdom." He could have asked for everything else, couldn't he? And on that score, God was pleased with this choice that Solomon made, wasn't he? Because he didn't seek for the things that would satisfy his lust. He sought for the wisdom of God, completely in harmony with what James is speaking of here and the thinking of God. Verse 4, "You adulterers and adulteresses, or you adulterous people, as Sam read, because it seems to be emphasising the fact that if we forsake that way of devoting ourselves to God and Him alone, we become adulteresses, don't we? We've been betrothed to God, we've given our lives to God, yet we go off and we seek for other pleasures outside of that relationship. And so therefore we are seen as being adulterous people. Know ye not that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. The friendship there, philia, fondness. Don't you know that having a fondness for the world and all that it represents, that is enmity with God. You can't have the two together, can you? You can't be a friend of God and a friend of the world. It does not work because they're driven by two different ideologies, starkly different ideologies, driving to two different ends. They can't be there in the same person, can they? It's an impossibility. So if our passions or desires are for the things of this world, then God sees us, doesn't he, as being adulterous people. Verse 5, do you think that the scripture saith in vain, the spirit that dwelleth in us lusteth to envy? Bit of a challenging verse, and it can be described in different ways. But it's talking about desires and lusts and envy or jealousy, isn't it? Two ideas that come out of there. Desires and lusts and envies and jealousies. And following on from the context of verse 4, where God is addressing those that depart from their devotion to him as being adulterous people, taking that as the context, I think we can see in this verse that God wants our love. He wants to be our desire and our passion. But our natural desires are for the lusts of the things of the flesh. So we've got a lust working within us. We've got a desire that's working within us, which is going away from God. God has got a desire in him, which is wanting to draw us to him. And so we can see this tension, can't we? When we follow our lusts, then God is jealous about that, isn't he? So this is about a relationship with our God. And that relationship must be built on faithfulness, mustn't it? Faithfulness and devotion. Or there's going to be division, isn't there? When one is lusting after something else opposed to God. There's a breakdown of that relationship. And great dissatisfaction comes from that, doesn't it? I think this sort of picks up some of the ideas from Genesis chapter 6, verse 5 and 6, when God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth. It grieved him at his heart. Because there'd been a breakdown of that relationship, hadn't there? Because men had gone off and lusting after other things, thinking of other things. And here was God. He was grieved in his heart by the fact that people would depart from that way of thinking which is acceptable to him. That's a pretty sad story, isn't it, in the opening of James chapter 4. But who of us is free of guilt in allowing selfish desires to breach our relationship with God? That's a bit confronting, isn't it? Which of us is free of guilt in allowing selfish desires to breach our relationship with God? But we go on and read in verse 6, don't we? But he giveth more grace. That's why we're here this morning, isn't it? Because God gives more grace. As it were, he's acting like a gracious husband here, isn't he? He's willing to restore the relationship because of his graciousness. And our continuing relationship with God depends on that grace, doesn't it? I'd like to just jump ahead though and just consider some words from verses 11 to 16 before coming back to verses 6 to 10. We certainly hope that none of us are so dominated by the excesses of fleshly thinking that we would go to the extent spoken of in chapter 4, verse 1 and 2. Fighting and wars, murder even. adultery. Terrible things that are being spoken about. But could it be that similar thinking within, or thinking that is not pure on the things of God, can cause us to stray from being full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy? Could it be that maybe we don't see ourselves as going to the same excesses of verses 1 and 2, but maybe we don't go the whole way of achieving that ideal of being full of mercy and good fruits without partiality, without hypocrisy? Does the pride of life still play a part in our daily lives? In verses 11 and 12, James speaks about that pride that destroys brethren. Speak not evil one of another, brethren. He that speaketh evil of his brother and judgeth his brother speaketh evil of the law and judgeth the law. But if thou judge the law, thou art not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. Who art thou that judgest another? It picks up the same idea, doesn't it, in chapter 5, verse 9. Grudge not against one another, brethren, lest ye be condemned. So there can be, can't be, arising from the pride within, that selfishness and thinking that we're better than everyone else, there can be evil speaking, can't there? Evil speaking that, while maybe it's not murder, oftentimes it's there to destroy another person, isn't it? And why would you engage in that? What would be the motivation to put someone else down? Unfortunately, so often it's because people want to lift themselves up, isn't it? So they walk all over everyone else in the thinking that it's going to lift them up and make them better. It's just so destructive, isn't it, of our relationships and of ourselves. And we can contrast that, can't we, to verse 10, where we put ourselves down so that God will lift us up. But how is it that when we put others down, how is it that this is speaking evil of the law and judging the law? Well, in James chapter 2, verse 8, James says, if ye fulfil the royal law according to Scripture, thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself, you do well. He says, here's one law to think about. Here's a royal law upon which the rest of the laws are ordained. The principle that you love your neighbour as yourself. But if you're going to go out and speak evil of your brother, if you're going to denigrate him, if you're going to seek to destroy him or his reputation, is that to love your brother as yourself? So you've contradicted the law, haven't you? You've gone against the law. You've put yourself above the law. You no longer think you're subject to the law. You think you're a judge of the law. You think you can make your own laws, that you're above that. And you've got the right to act how you want. And so we see this pride rising up, isn't it? To the extent where a person thinks that they're free of the law for themselves, but they'll bring it down heavy on everyone else. Not being merciful and peaceful, is it? Or in verse 13 through to 16, he talks about a pride that does away with God. Where it says, go to now ye that say, today or tomorrow we will go into such a city and continue there a year and buy and sell and get gain. Whereas ye know not what shall be on the morrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapour. It appears for a little time and then vanishes away. You ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. But now you rejoice in your boasting. All such rejoicing is evil. So rather than having that humble disposition which says, God, I need you, I need your wisdom, I need your guidance, I need to be taught by you, this is a person that's thinking, well, I'm in control of my own destiny. I don't really need God. The pride of life welling up, isn't it? And this is a reminder that we aren't in control of our lives. God is. and we are but a vapour, as it says in Psalm 39 verse 5. Indeed, you have made my days as handbreadths, and my age is as nothing before you. Certainly every man at his best state is but vapour. And yet, we in our foolish pride sometimes rise up and think that we're better, that we're controlling our own destiny, that we can achieve things, that we can do things, that we can gain satisfaction for ourselves, that we can map out our own course in life. And that's a thinking that comes from within, out of the uneducated mind, isn't it? This describes a person who's focused on the success in this life, isn't it? Trying to apply their worldly wisdom or knowledge to buy, to sell, to get gain, to get ahead in life. Not accepting that wisdom is there to form a better character, but this person wants to be successful in life, don't they? They want to be successful in the things of this world. That's their motivation. And here they are trying to prove the findings of Ecclesiastes wrong, aren't they? They think they're going to buy, sell and get gain. Whereas Ecclesiastes 2 verse 11 says, on the labour in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind, there was no profit under the sun. No profit, no gain under the sun, it says. But here's this man, this uneducated man who's pushed the thinking of God out of his mind. He's driven by natural thinking. He's driven by the lusts and the impulses of the flesh. And he's striving for success in the things of this life. And he thinks he can do away with God. And he's going to buy, he's going to sell, he's going to get gain. He's going to gain satisfaction, he thinks. But Solomon has already proven that there is no profit. There is no gain under the sun. Living with that mentality, there is no gain. We are but a vapour. And so maybe there are some of the things that can challenge us in our lives, can't we? How we relate to other people. Are we nice to other people? Are we kind and compassionate? Do we acknowledge that our purpose of this life is not to gain the things of this world, but to bring glory to God? Are we ready to rid ourselves of the thinking of the flesh and take on that thinking of God? And so in chapter 4, verse 6 to 10, James has spoken about the restoring of relationships with God, hasn't he? As you'd already seen in verse 6, God gives more grace. God gives more grace, and of that we are thankful. Wherefore he saith, God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. Our continuing relationship with God depends on his grace, and his grace depends on our humility. Getting rid of the pride of life. Coming to God with a humble spirit, ready to be guided, to be changed, to be converted. Acknowledging our foolishness and our weakness. Come to God with that attitude, and he will give us grace. Whereas God resists the proud, he ranges oneself against. He opposes the proud. He's going to give grace to the humble, but the person that's driven by the pride of life, the person that's driven by their own intelligence, their own thinking, their own way of acting, that puts themselves up and is not humble like a little child, God will range himself against that person. Totally contrasting opinion that God has of those two different ways of thinking, doesn't it? So he goes on in verse 7, submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. And to submit ourselves to God means resisting or rejecting the devil, our own will, isn't it? Submitting to God means that we give ourselves to him. We get rid of our own thinking. We reject, we resist the thinking of the flesh. We drive that out of our lives. Verse 8, draw nigh to God and he will draw nigh to you. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. We're the ones with the problem, and we've got to take action, don't we? We've got to cleanse our hands speaking of our actions. We've got to purify our hearts, speaking of our thoughts and our motivation, our way of thinking. We've got to change that, don't we? And we've got to draw nigh to God. Verse 9, we've got to be afflicted and mourn and weep, acknowledging the state we are in. Verse 10, we've got to humble ourselves in the sight of God so that he can lift us up. So there's a great theme there, isn't there? If we want to restore that relationship with God, got that idea of verse 6, humble, verse 7, submit, verse 8, to draw nigh, verse 9, to be afflicted, to mourn, to weep, verse 10, to humble ourselves, to put ourselves down so that God will lift us up. And there's some wonderfully positive statements here, isn't there? Resist the devil, he will flee from you. Draw nigh to God, he will draw nigh to you. Humble yourselves in the sight of God, he shall lift you up. In these words, what James calls on all his brethren to do is what he saw in the life of his half-brother Jesus. One who welcomed instruction from the Father, opening his ear every morning to listen like a disciple. A life that demonstrated that he was full of the wisdom and understanding that comes from above. A life that was peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, without hypocrisy. A life of selflessness in fulfilment of that royal law. A life of submission to God, resisting all that God hates, resisting unto blood all that God hates. And the one whom God has lifted up. Wherefore God also hath highly exalted him, and given him a name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of things in heaven and things in earth and things under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father.